There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, their edges softened by the familiar hum of a refrigerator or the gentle glow of a street lamp through a thin curtain. They don't announce themselves with thunder or fanfare. They slip into the quiet spaces, into the pauses between breaths, and only in retrospect do you see them for what they were. The subtle shifting of tectonic plates, the first hairline crack in the foundation of the world you thought you knew. For me, that moment was a whisper in the dark, a handful of words that should have made no sense at all, but instead rearranged the entire architecture of my heart. It was the sound of my best friend, my roommate, Ethan, his voice thick with sleep and something else I couldn't name, murmuring into the space between our pillows. He said, "I can't stop thinking about last night," and the devastating, terrifying, beautiful truth was that, according to every law of physics and fact that I understood, absolutely nothing had happened last night. To understand the weight of those 7 words, you have to understand the silence they shattered. You have to understand the years of carefully constructed friendship that preceded them, the unspoken rules and invisible lines I had meticulously drawn around my own heart to keep it safe from the one person most likely to break it. Ethan and I had met in college, 2 celestial bodies of entirely different compositions somehow caught in the same gravitational pull. I was a quiet art student, more comfortable behind the lens of a camera than in the middle of a conversation, happiest in the solitary peace of a darkroom, watching images slowly bloom into existence in the chemical bath. He was a force of nature, a collegiate swimmer with shoulders that seemed to contain the sun and a laugh that could fill a stadium. He moved through the world with an effortless confidence that I could only ever hope to capture on film, a bright, burning energy that drew people to him like moths. I was one of those moths, I suppose, though I tried to pretend I was only there to study the flame. We were assigned as roommates in our sophomore year, a random act of university housing that would become the single most defining event of my young adult life. I remember seeing him for the first time, hauling a duffel bag that looked comically small against the backdrop of his frame, his hair still damp from a morning practice, smelling faintly of chlorine and clean laundry. He'd grinned, a flash of white in a tanned face, and said, "Liam, right? Promise I don't snore." Much, and just like that, the quiet, ordered room I had started to build for myself was flooded with his light, his noise, his sheer, overwhelming presence. For the first few months, I was a quiet observer, a documentarian of this strange new habitat. I watched the way he'd toss his keys into the same ceramic bowl by the door every single time, the way he'd study for his engineering exams by pacing the length of our small room, muttering formulas under his breath. I learned that he was fiercely loyal, impossibly kind, and had a baffling affinity for terrible, late-night reality television. He, in turn, seemed to accept my quietness not as a flaw or a challenge, but simply as a fact of my existence. He learned to read my moods in the set of my shoulders or the choice of music drifting from my headphones. He'd leave a cup of tea on my desk without a word when he knew I was struggling with a project, a silent offering that spoke volumes more than any loud encouragement could. It was in those small, unspoken kindnesses that the foundation of my feelings was laid. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic fall. It was a slow erosion, a gradual seeping into the soil of my being. It was the night he found me in the campus photo lab at 3 in the morning, my eyes burning with exhaustion, and gently took a developing tray from my hands. He'd said, "Come on, man. The pictures will still be here tomorrow," and he'd walk me back to our dorm, his arms slung loosely over my shoulders, a casual gesture that felt like an anchor in a storm. It was the way he'd brag to his boisterous teammates about my photography, pulling up my portfolio on his phone with a pride that made my cheeks burn. "Look at this," he'd say. "Liam's a genius. He sees things nobody else does." He never knew that most of what I saw, most of what I was trying to capture, was him. The way light caught in his hair after a run, the rare, unguarded moments of contemplation on his face when he thought no one was watching. My camera loved him, and I, its wielder, was utterly lost. I built a fortress around that love. It was a masterpiece of emotional architecture, designed for containment. The walls were made of our friendship, thick and solid. The moat was his succession of bright, beautiful girlfriends, each one a testament to a world I couldn't access. And the highest tower, the one where I locked the feeling itself away, was the unspoken assumption of his heterosexuality. It wasn't just an assumption, it was an observable fact, a data point confirmed again and again. He loved women. He was a good and decent boyfriend to them. To even imagine anything else felt like a betrayal, a rewriting of his very being to suit my own selfish narrative. So I became the perfect friend, the confidant, the guy who listened to his relationship woes, who offered advice, who was always there. I learned to smile and nod when he talked about a new girl, to push down the familiar, acidic churn in my stomach and replace it with practiced, platonic support. It was a slow, quiet form of self-immolation, but the warmth of his friendship was worth the burn. After graduation, our paths should have diverged. He had a high-paying consulting job lined up, a life of airports and client dinners. I was piecing together a freelance photography career, a life of uncertain paychecks and endless hustle. But the gravitational pull held. When his lease fell through at the last minute, it was me he called. "Any chance your spare room is still available?" he'd asked, and the relief in my voice was, I hoped, attributable to the prospect of a reliable roommate to help with rent. We moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. It was a space defined by boundaries. His room, my room. His bathroom, my bathroom. The shared living room and kitchen were in neutral territory, a demilitarized zone. For 3 years, this system worked. It was a fragile peace, but it was peace nonetheless. His life was a whirlwind of travel, of coming and going. My life was the steady, quiet hum of home. I was the anchor, the constant he returned to after his flights, and I told myself that was enough. He was dating Sarah then, a smart, funny lawyer he'd met through mutual friends. Their relationship was serious, the kind that led to discussions of joint bank accounts and holiday plans with in-laws. She was wonderful, and I hated myself for the small, petty part of me that resented her for it. When they were together in our apartment, the space felt different, smaller. Ethan's energy, which usually filled the rooms and spilled out the windows, was focused entirely on her. I would retreat to my room, to my darkroom, giving them the space that was rightfully theirs. I became a ghost in my own home, a polite, smiling phantom who would occasionally emerge for a glass of water, my presence a brief, awkward interruption to their domestic bliss. I was happy for him. But I was also profoundly, achingly lonely, a feeling that was sharpest when I could hear their laughter through my closed door. The shift began, as so many shifts do, with an ending. His ending with Sarah. It wasn't a dramatic, explosive breakup. It was a slow, sad fizzle, a mutual recognition that their futures were pulling them in different directions. He told me about it one Tuesday night, sitting on our worn leather couch, staring at the blank television screen. He didn't cry. He just looked hollowed out, a building emptied of its furniture, the echoes of laughter still hanging in the air. He spoke in a low monotone, explaining the logistics of it, the who gets the concert tickets and the what do we do about the ski trip. He was processing it like one of his engineering problems, breaking it down into manageable components. But there was a tremor in his hand when he reached for his glass, a subtle vibration that betrayed the calm of his voice. I didn't offer platitudes or easy reassurances. I just sat with him in the quiet, a silent partner in his grief. After a long while, he finally looked at me, his eyes glassy. "It just feels quiet," he said. And I knew he wasn't just talking about the absence of her voice in the apartment. He was talking about a fundamental silence that had opened up in his life. I just nodded. "I know," I said. It was all I could offer. It was the only truth I had. That night, he didn't go to his own room. He fell asleep on the couch, his head tilted back at an awkward angle, the remote slipping from his slack fingers. I watched him for a long time, the familiar ache in my chest sharper than usual. I gently lifted his legs onto the cushions and draped a blanket over him, my fingers brushing against the rough denim of his jeans. It was the most I had touched him in years, and it felt like both a sacrilege and a prayer. That night was the beginning of the ritual. It was the first crack in the dam. His work, always demanding, became relentless. The breakup had untethered him, and he seemed to pour all of that restless, grieving energy into his job. He was on a plane every other week, chasing deadlines across time zones, running on fumes and caffeine. When he was home, he was a ghost. He'd arrive late at night, his suit rumpled, his face pale with exhaustion. The confident, sunbright energy was gone, replaced by a deep, weary stillness. He stopped going out with friends. He stopped going to the gym. He would just come home, to the apartment, to me. The couch was the first stage. He'd collapse onto it after a long day, intending to watch an hour of television to decompress. I'd be on the other end, editing photos on my laptop, the quiet clicks of my trackpad a steady rhythm in the room. We'd talk a little, his words slurring with fatigue. He'd tell me about a frustrating client, a delayed flight. I'd tell him about a potential gig, a new lens I was saving for. And then, inevitably, his words would trail off. His breathing would deepen. I'd look over, and he'd be asleep, his head lolling to the side. The first few times, I'd let him be. But one night, he slumped sideways, his head landing softly on my thigh. My entire body went rigid. It was like a live wire had been pressed against my skin. I could feel the warmth of him through my jeans, the surprisingly soft texture of his hair. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his shampoo. I sat there for what felt like an hour, my laptop forgotten, my own breathing shallow. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to gently dislodge him, to restore the boundary. It was dangerous. It was a territory I had promised myself I would never enter. But then he sighed in his sleep, a soft, contented sound, and burrowed his face a little deeper against my leg. He looked so peaceful, so unguarded. The weariness of the past few months seemed to have momentarily lifted from his face, and I couldn't bring myself to disturb that. So I stayed. I sat there in the dark, my legs slowly going numb, my heart pounding a frantic, silent rhythm against my ribs, and I let him sleep. This became the new, unspoken normal. It happened once, then twice, then nearly every night he was home. The pretense of watching television was a thin veneer over the truth. He was seeking a place to rest, and for some reason, that place was me. I began to anticipate it, to dread it, to yearn for it. It was a sweet, agonizing torture. My mind would race, cataloging every detail. The weight of his head, the way his hand would sometimes rest near my knee, the soft puff of his breath against my leg. I was a scientist studying a new, volatile element, terrified it might explode at any moment. I told myself it meant nothing. It was about proximity and exhaustion. I was a warm body, a convenient pillow, nothing more. It was a mantra I repeated to myself, a desperate attempt to keep the fortress walls from crumbling. Then, the ritual escalated. It was a freezing night in January. A pipe had burst in his bathroom, and the landlord had to shut off the water to his side of the apartment for repairs. He came into the living room where I was reading, a towel slung around his neck. "Hey," he said, looking uncharacteristically sheepish. "Mind if I use your shower?" "Of course not," I said, my voice betraying none of the sudden lurch in my stomach. The sound of my shower running, a sound I'd only ever associated with myself, was suddenly intimate, foreign. When he came out, wrapped in a towel, his hair dripping onto the floor, he looked lost. "My room's freezing," he said. They had to turn off the heat on that side, too. I knew what was coming. I could see the question forming in his eyes, and I braced myself for it. "And my bed is damp." From the dripping, he gestured vaguely toward his room. There it was. The plausible deniability. The perfect excuse. A series of unfortunate events that would lead him exactly where, I was beginning to suspect, some subconscious part of him wanted to be. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and apology. "I know this is a huge ask, but do you think, could I just crash on your floor? Or—" He let the question hang in the air. My room was not large. The floor was not an option. We both knew it. There was only one place for him to sleep. My heart was a hummingbird trapped in my chest. This was a new level of proximity, a new, terrifying frontier. The couch was one thing. My bed was a sanctuary. It was the one place in the world that was entirely mine. To let him into it felt like letting him into the deepest, most vulnerable part of myself. The part one had kept locked away for years. But looking at his tired, hopeful face, seeing the genuine exhaustion etched around his eyes, I couldn't say no. It would have been cruel. It would have been an admission that his presence there meant something more to me, a crack in the facade of our easy friendship. So I gave a small, casual shrug, as if it were the most normal request in the world. "Don't be an idiot, Ethan. The floor is freezing. Just take the other side of the bed." The gratitude that washed over his face was so profound it almost made me feel guilty for my own hesitation. Really? Man, thank you. You're a lifesaver. He disappeared into his room to grab his pillows, and I was left standing in the middle of my own, my mind reeling. I was trying to frame it, to put it in a box I could manage. It was practical. It was temporary. It was what any good friend would do. I changed into a t-shirt and sweats, my hands trembling slightly. I climbed into my side of the bed, hugging the very edge, creating as much space as the queen-sized mattress would allow. I felt like an explorer charting a new continent, acutely aware of the vast, empty territory beside me. When he came back, he was wearing a pair of worn gray sweatpants and an old college t-shirt. He moved quietly, as if not to startle me. He slid under the covers, his back to me, keeping a respectful distance. But the space was no longer empty. It was filled with his presence, with the heat radiating from his body, with the sound of his breathing. The air in the room felt thick, charged. I lay there, rigid, staring at the ceiling, listening. I could hear the rustle of the sheets as he shifted, trying to get comfortable. I could smell the scent of my own soap on his skin from the shower. It was an impossibly intimate detail, a sensory overlap that scrambled my brain. I don't know how long I lay awake, every nerve ending firing. But eventually, from the other side of the bed, his voice came, soft and low. Liam. I swallowed. Yeah. Thanks again. For this, it's fine, I managed to say, my voice sounding strained to my own ears. Get some sleep. There was another long pause. Then, night, man, night, I whispered back. I listened as his breathing slowly evened out, deepening into the familiar rhythm of sleep. Only then did I allow myself to relax, just a fraction. The heat from his body was a comforting presence in the cold room. Against all odds, against all my carefully constructed defenses, a profound sense of peace began to settle over me. He was here. He was safe. He was warm. And for tonight, in this small, shared space, that was all that mattered. The pipe was fixed the next day, but the boundary had been irrevocably breached. A precedent had been set. The door, once firmly closed, was now unlocked. The next time he came home, shattered from a trip to the West Coast, he didn't even bother with the couch. He just appeared in my doorway late at night, pillow in hand, looking like a weary traveler seeking refuge. He didn't offer an excuse this time. He just looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. And I just nodded, moving over to my side of the bed. The ritual had evolved. The plausible deniability was wearing thin, becoming a transparent film we both pretended not to see through. It became our thing. When Ethan was home and exhausted, he slept in my bed. We didn't talk about it. We didn't acknowledge it in the morning. We'd wake up, he'd go to his room to get dressed, and we'd meet in the kitchen for coffee as if nothing had happened, as if we hadn't just spent 8 hours sharing the same intimate space, our bodies sometimes just inches apart. For me, those nights were a study in exquisite torture. I became a connoisseur of his sleep. I learned that he sometimes kicked in his dreams, that he muttered about spreadsheets and flight numbers. I learned that when he was deeply asleep, he would unconsciously seek out warmth, sometimes rolling over until his back was pressed against mine, or an arm was thrown carelessly over my waist. The first time that happened, I stopped breathing. His arm was heavy, solid, and impossibly warm. I lay there, pinned, my heart hammering against my ribs, convinced he would wake up at any second, realize what he was doing, and recoil in horror. But he just sighed, a deep, contented sound, and slept on. I didn't move for the rest of the night, terrified of breaking the spell. I was a statue, a monument to unspoken feelings, and his arm was the wreath laid at my feet. And that brings us to last night. It was a night like any other in our new, strange reality. He'd gotten in late from Chicago, looking more drained than I'd ever seen him. He'd barely managed a hello before disappearing into my shower and then emerging, wrapped in a towel, to grab his sweatpants from his room. He'd returned and collapsed into bed without a word, falling asleep almost instantly. I had stayed up late, working on a deadline, the soft glow of my laptop the only light in the room. He'd been restless, turning over and over, his limbs tangling with mine in the dark. At one point, I'd woken up from a light doze to find us facing each other, his face just inches from mine, his breath warm on my cheek. His arm was draped over my side, his hand resting on my hip. It was the closest we had ever been. My own hand, as if with a will of its own, had lifted, my fingers hovering just over his hair. I wanted, more than anything, to touch him, to smooth the worried line between his brows. But I didn't. I couldn't. It was a line I still wasn't brave enough to cross. I just watched him breathe until the first gray light of dawn began to creep into the room. Then I had carefully, painstakingly, extracted myself from his embrace and moved to the very edge of the bed. So when I woke up later that morning to the sound of his whisper, I can't stop thinking about last night. My world tilted on its axis. He was lying on his side, facing me, his eyes still closed. I thought, for a wild, hopeful second, that he was talking about that moment in the pre-dawn light. That he had been awake, too. That he had felt it. The intimacy, the charge, the feeling of something significant passing between us. My heart seized in my chest, a wild, frantic bird beating against a cage. I held my breath, waiting. He shifted, his eyes fluttering open. They were hazy with sleep, unfocused. He blinked a few times, and then his gaze landed on me. For a second, there was nothing. Just two people in a bed. And then, a slow wave of confusion washed over his face. He seemed to be trying to place himself, to understand the context. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his brow furrowed. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice raspy. He ran a hand through his messy hair, looking around the room as if seeing it for the first time. The spell was broken. The boy who had whispered those earth-shattering words was gone, replaced by my friend, my roommate, Ethan, who looked slightly disoriented and completely oblivious. He swung his legs out of bed, stretched with a groan, and headed for the door. "Coffee?" he asked over his shoulder, the same question he asked every morning. I just stared at the empty space where he had been. My mind was a maelstrom, a chaotic whirlwind of hope and confusion. Had I dreamed it? Had my sleep-deprived, longing-addled brain manufactured those words out of thin air? But it had felt so real. The warmth of his breath, the low timbre of his voice. I replayed the moment again and again, a photographer examining a negative for a detail he might have missed. I can't stop thinking about last night he'd said it. I was sure he'd said it. But his behavior now, his casual, easy normalcy, was a direct contradiction to that statement. It was as if he'd opened a door into a secret room and then, upon waking, had forgotten the door ever existed. The days that followed were a quiet, agonizing hell. I was on high alert, watching him for any sign, any hint that he remembered what he'd said. I analyzed every word, every gesture. When he smiled at me, was it different? When he passed me in the hallway, did his arm brush against mine for a fraction of a second longer than necessary? I was driving myself mad, caught in a loop of hope and doubt. He, for his part, seemed completely unaffected. He was still tired, still leaning on me for that silent, physical comfort. The ritual continued. He still sought out my bed on the nights he was home, still fell asleep with his head on my shoulder on the couch. But the dynamic had shifted for me. It was no longer a passive act of comfort. It was an active search for meaning. His whisper had turned me from a quiet observer into a desperate detective, searching for clues in a case where the only other witness had amnesia. The tension inside me was building, a pressure cooker with a faulty valve. I felt like I was living a double life. In one, I was Liam, the steady, reliable friend. In the other, I was a man consumed by a single, whispered sentence. I couldn't focus on my work. The faces in my photographs looked back at me with knowing eyes. The silence in my darkroom felt accusatory. The fortress I had built around my heart was not just cracking. It was crumbling, stone by stone, and I was powerless to stop it. I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that something had to break. The ambiguity was no longer a safe space. It had become a cage. The breaking point came a week later. It was another night, another repetition of the ritual. He was back from a short trip, and the familiar pattern began. We were on the couch, a documentary about deep-sea life playing on the screen. I wasn't watching it. I was watching him. He was leaning against the armrest, his eyes heavy-lidded. He was fighting it tonight, trying to stay awake, but it was a losing battle. He kept blinking slowly, his head nodding forward before he'd jerk it back up. Finally, he gave in. He slid down, his body uncurling, and laid his head in its now familiar spot on my lap. He was asleep in minutes. And I just sat there, the blue light of the television washing over us. I looked down at his face, so peaceful in sleep. The dark circles under his eyes seemed less pronounced. The lines of stress around his mouth had softened. He looked younger, more like the boy I'd met in college, full of uncomplicated sunshine. And a wave of profound tenderness and unbearable frustration washed over me. I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't live in this gray space, this world of unspoken things and ambiguous gestures. The risk of staying silent suddenly felt greater than the risk of speaking. Ruining our friendship would be devastating. But slowly losing my mind in this quiet, lonely limbo that felt like a kind of death. I don't know what came over me. It was a moment of madness, of pure, unadulterated desperation. I gently, so gently, reached out my hand. My fingers trembled as they hovered over his cheek. This was it. The line. I was going to cross it. I was going to touch him, really touch him, and whatever happened after, I would have to face it. My fingertips were millimeters from his skin when his eyes shot open. We both froze. My hand was still poised in the air between us, a damning piece of evidence. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the tinny voice of the documentary narrator talking about bioluminescent creatures in the abyss. I felt like one of those creatures, suddenly illuminated in the darkness, my strange, hidden self exposed for all to see. I couldn't breathe. My heart had stopped. This was the end, the moment I had dreaded for years. He would see my hand, he would see the look on my face, and he would finally understand. He would be disgusted, or horrified, or worse, just pitying. He would pull away, and the world we had built together would shatter into a million irreparable pieces. But he didn't pull away. He didn't even flinch. He just looked at me, his gaze searching my face, his own expression unreadable. His eyes darted from my eyes down to my hovering hand and back again. The moment stretched into an eternity. I should have pulled my hand back, laughed it off, made a joke. But I was paralyzed, trapped in the honesty of the moment. And then, he did something that completely dismantled my reality. He turned his head slightly, pressing his cheek into my waiting palm. The contact was electric. A shockwave went through my entire system. His skin was warm, the faint stubble of his beard rough against my fingertips. He closed his eyes, a soft sigh escaping his lips, as if he'd been waiting for this touch his entire life. My hand, which had been trembling, went still. I wasn't just an observer anymore. I was a participant. The photograph was developing right in front of me, and I was part of the image. He nuzzled his face into my hand, a small, almost feline gesture of pure comfort and trust. My thumb, moving on its own accord, stroked softly along his cheekbone. He didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. The words were unnecessary. The truth was here, in this touch. It was in the way his whole body seemed to relax into me, the way the tension finally drained out of his shoulders. We stayed like that for a long time, the television murmuring forgotten in the background. My anger, my frustration, my desperate need for answers, it all just melted away, replaced by a feeling so vast and overwhelming I couldn't put a name to it. It was peace. It was terror. It was the feeling of coming home to a place you never knew you were searching for. Finally, his voice, a low, rough whisper, broke the spell. It was so quiet I almost didn't hear it. Liam. I could only manage a choked sound in response. He opened his eyes again. They were clear now, and filled with a terrifying, beautiful vulnerability. Can I ask you something stupid? I nodded, my throat too tight for words. He took a breath, his gaze unwavering. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath with him. Would it be okay, he started, his voice cracking slightly. Would it be okay if I kissed you? The question hung in the air between us, more real, more solid than anything I had ever known. It wasn't a proposition. It wasn't a joke. It was a plea. It was a confession. It was the key to the locked room, offered to me on a silver platter. All the years of pining, of silent observation, of carefully managed friendship, all led to this single, impossible moment. My mind, which had been racing for weeks, went completely silent. There was no more analysis, no more doubt. There was only him. His face, illuminated by the flickering light of the screen. His cheek, warm beneath my hand. His eyes, waiting for my answer. I didn't trust my voice, so I just nodded again, a small, jerky movement. And then I leaned down, closing the small distance that remained between our world and a new one. The kiss was nothing like I had ever imagined. In my dreams, it had always been something desperate, passionate, a release of years of pent-up longing. But this was different. It was soft. It was tentative. It was unbelievably gentle. It was just the barest pressure of his lips against mine, a question and an answer all in one. It tasted of salt and sleep and a quiet, hesitant hope. It lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. When we pulled away, we were both breathless. I rested my forehead against his, my hand still cradling his face. His eyes were closed, a single tear tracing a path from the corner of his eye into his hairline. He didn't pull away. He didn't say he was confused. He just stayed there, his hand coming up to rest on my chest, right over my frantic heart. We didn't speak for a long time after that. There was nothing to say. Everything had been said in that one quiet question and that one gentle kiss. Later, much later, I helped him up from the couch, and we walked to my room, his hand finding mine in the darkness. There was no pretext this time, no excuse about burst pipes or exhaustion. It was a choice, a deliberate, intentional act of togetherness. We climbed into bed, and for the first time, we faced each other. He pulled the covers up over us, and his arm came around me, pulling me close until my head was resting on his chest. I could hear the steady, solid thump of his heart beneath my ear. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I fell asleep like that, not as an observer, not as a convenient pillow, but as something new, something more. I woke up the next morning to an empty bed. The space beside me was cold. For a panicked moment, I thought I had dreamed it all. The confession, the touch, the kiss. It felt too fragile, too perfect to have been real. But then I saw it. His pillow was still on my bed, the indentation of his head a faint shadow on the case. It had been real. I sat up, my heart a confusing mix of elation and a new, creeping anxiety. I listened for the familiar sounds of him in the kitchen, the clink of a coffee mug, the rumble of the grinder. But there was only silence. A deep, unnerving silence that felt different from the comfortable quiet we usually shared. I got out of bed and walked into the living room. The apartment was empty. His keys were gone from the ceramic bowl. His laptop bag was missing from its usual spot by the door. A small, white envelope was propped up against the sugar bowl on the kitchen counter. My name was written on it in his familiar, slightly messy scrawl. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. I was terrified to open it. I was sure it would be an apology, a retraction, a desperate attempt to put everything back in the box. Liam, I'm so sorry. I was tired. I was confused. I wasn't thinking. Can we please just forget last night ever happened? I tore it open. The note inside was short, painfully brief. Had to fly to Boston for an emergency client meeting. Didn't want to wake you. Back in a few days. That was it. No mention of the kiss. No mention of the conversation. No hint of the monumental shift that had occurred between us. It was so clinical, so detached, it felt like a slap in the face. It was a retreat. A full-scale, panicked retreat. The new world we had glimpsed for a moment had vanished, and he had slammed the door shut behind him. The hope that had bloomed in my chest overnight withered and died, replaced by a cold, heavy dread. The next few days were the longest of my life. The silence in the apartment was no longer peaceful, it was oppressive. Every room echoed with his absence. I'd walk past his closed bedroom door and feel a pang of loss so acute it was physical. I tried to work, but I couldn't. I tried to read, but the words blurred on the page. I replayed our last night together over and over again. Had I misread everything? Was I just a port in a storm for him, a moment of weakness and confusion in his grief over Sarah? The thought was a shard of ice in my gut. Maybe his whispered confession about last night wasn't about the intimacy I had perceived. Maybe he couldn't stop thinking about it because it horrified him, because he was disgusted with himself for letting it happen. I was hurt, but more than that, I was angry. I was angry at him for his cowardice, for running away instead of talking to me. I was angry at myself for letting my guard down, for allowing myself to hope. I had spent years protecting myself from this exact scenario, and in one night, I had let him walk right past all my defenses and detonate a bomb in the center of my life. His text messages were sporadic and impersonal. Landed safely. Meeting went long. Hope you're having a good week. They were the texts of a casual acquaintance. Not the man who had asked to kiss me. Not the man who had held me all night. Each one was a small, fresh wound. He was due back on Friday evening. I spent the entire day in a state of high anxiety, my stomach in knots. I cleaned the apartment obsessively, as if scrubbing the floors could somehow scrub away the tension in the air. I didn't know what I was going to do when he walked through that door. Should I pretend it never happened, just as he seemed to be doing? Should I retreat back into my role as the safe, platonic friend? The thought was unbearable. I couldn't go back. The door had been opened, and I had seen what was on the other side. I couldn't unsee it. I couldn't unfeel it. I heard his keys in the lock a little after 8. My heart leaped into my throat. I was sitting on the couch, the same spot where he had confessed, where I had kissed him. It felt like a stage, set for the final act of a tragedy. He walked in, dropping his bag by the door. He looked exhausted, older than he had a few days ago. He saw me on the couch, and his face tightened. He couldn't meet my eyes. "Hey," he said, his voice quiet. He started to walk toward his room, as if he could just bypass me, bypass the entire situation. And in that moment, something in me snapped. The quiet observer, the patient friend, was gone. All the hurt and anger and confusion of the past few days coalesced into a single point of clarity. I would not let him run. I would not let him hide. I deserved more than a note on the counter. We deserved more than this suffocating silence. I stood up. "Don't," I said. My voice was low, but it held a new, steely edge that made him stop in his tracks. He turned slowly, his face a mask of weary apprehension. "Don't you dare walk into that room and pretend that nothing happened," I said, my voice shaking slightly now with the force of my emotion. "You don't get to do that. You don't get to ask me for something like that, to open that door, and then just run away and leave me here to clean up the mess." He flinched as if I'd struck him. He still wouldn't look at me, his gaze fixed on a point on the floor somewhere between us. "Liam, he started, but his voice trailed off. "You what, Ethan?" I pressed, taking a step closer. "You were confused? You were tired? You made a mistake? Is that what you were going to say? Because I have spent years listening to you, being your friend, putting my own life on hold to be whatever you needed me to be. The one thing I won't be is your mistake." The words came pouring out of me, a torrent of everything I had held back for so long. Finally, he looked up, and his face was wrecked with a pain that mirrored my own. His eyes were red-rimmed and filled with a desperate, frantic confusion. "I don't know what I am," he burst out, his voice cracking. "Okay, I don't know. I lie in bed next to you, and for the first time in months, for the first time since Sarah, maybe ever, I feel quiet. I feel peaceful, and it feels right. It feels more right than anything has in a very long time." He took a ragged breath, gesturing wildly with his hands. "And then I wake up, and the sun is out, and the world is normal, and it feels terrifying. It feels impossible. It doesn't fit with anything I know about myself. It doesn't fit with who I'm supposed to be." He sank down onto the edge of the armchair, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. "That morning, when I whispered that thing," he said, his voice muffled. "I was half asleep, dreaming, but I was dreaming about the night before. About just lying next to you. The feeling of it. And when I woke up and said it out loud, it was like I'd spoken some forbidden truth. It scared the hell out of me, so I hadn't imagined it. It was real. All of it. He'd felt it too. The relief was so profound it almost buckled my knees, but it was followed by a wave of empathy for the man crumbling in front of me. His panic, his flight, it wasn't about me. It was about him. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself. I walked over and knelt on the floor in front of him. I gently pulled his hands away from his face. His cheeks were wet with tears. "Hey," I said softly, my anger completely gone, replaced by that familiar, overwhelming tenderness. "Look at me." He met my eyes, his own swimming with shame and fear. "There is no supposed to be, Ethan," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "There's just what is. There's just how you feel. You don't have to have it all figured out right now. You don't have to put a label on it. You just have to stop running." I took his hand, my fingers lacing with his. "You just have to be here, with me, and we can figure out the rest of it together." He stared at our joined hands, then back up at my face. A long, shuddering sigh escaped him, the sound of a battle finally being surrendered. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry, Liam. I was scared, I know," I said. "I was scared too." He squeezed my hand, a silent acknowledgement of everything we had been through, everything we had yet to face. "I don't want to run anymore," he said, his voice barely audible. And in that moment, I knew we were going to be okay. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clean, quiet stillness. The foundation that had cracked was not destroyed. It was just settling into a new, more honest shape. The days that followed were a process of careful reconstruction. We talked. For the first time, we really talked. We sat on the couch, not with the television on as a buffer, but in a comfortable silence that we filled, slowly and carefully, with our truths. He told me about the crushing loneliness of his job, the feeling of living in a perpetual state of transit, never truly landing anywhere. He confessed that his relationship with Sarah, as much as he'd loved her, had always felt like he was playing a part, following a script that everyone else had memorized but him. He said that the quiet moments with me, the late-night talks, the comfortable silences, even the shared grief, were the only times he felt like he could take off the costume and just breathe. I, in turn, confessed the years of my own quiet longing, the fortress I had built to protect myself, the terror and hope I'd felt as he began to dismantle it brick by brick. I told him about my camera and how it was always searching for him. It was a terrifyingly vulnerable admission, laying bare the deepest part of myself. He didn't flinch. He just listened, his expression soft, his hand resting on my knee. When I was finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "All that time, you saw me." Even when I couldn't see myself, the simple truth of his words hung in the air between us, beautiful and profound. We began to build a new set of rituals, ones based not on pretext and plausible deniability, but on open, intentional affection. The bedroom door was no longer a symbol of a breached boundary. It was simply a door. Sometimes it was open, sometimes it was closed, but more often than not, we were both on the same side of it. We fell asleep together every night, not because one of us was too tired to make it to his own room, but because we chose to. There was an easy, domestic rhythm to our new life. The small gestures that had once been fraught with meaning were now just life. His hand finding mine as we walked down the street. The way he'd lean over and kiss my temple while I was editing photos. The simple, profound comfort of waking up in the morning and seeing his face on the pillow next to mine. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. I found him in the kitchen, wearing one of my old t-shirts, pouring hot water into the French press. The morning light streamed in through the window, catching the dust motes dancing in the air, illuminating him in a way that made my artist's heart ache with the beauty of it. He looked up and smiled, a real smile, one that reached his eyes and made them crinkle at the corners. It was the sunbright smile of the boy I'd met in college, but it was different now. It was deeper, quieter, more certain. "Morning," he said, his voice warm and easy. He held out a mug to me, and as I took it, his fingers brushed against mine. It was a simple touch, an ordinary moment, but it was everything. It was the culmination of a long, quiet journey from observation to participation, from loneliness to a shared home. We never did figure out a neat label for what we were, not right away. The words felt too small, too inadequate for the vast, quiet space we had built between us. What we had was something crafted from shared silence, from hesitant touches, from the terrifying and beautiful vulnerability of two people choosing to see and be seen. We had found our way out of the gray space, not into a world of black and white definitions, but into a world of color, a world of our own making. We began to heal, not just from our own individual hurts, but from the quiet wounds we had unknowingly inflicted on each other in the years of our careful, loving, and ultimately unsustainable friendship. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had finally learned to create together.